The Hollow Inheritance. The door hadn't been opened in 3 seasons. I could tell by the way it had swollen shut, the wood pressing back against my shoulder, like it had forgotten what doors were for. I was 34 years old, divorced 8 months, jobless for 3. Standing on a mountain in Carter County, Tennessee with $200 and a car that needed new brake pads. The lawyer called it a liability. My grandmother called it home. She left it to me, not to my mother, not to my cousin Darren, who'd asked about it twice at the funeral before the casket was even in the ground. To me, a woman with nothing to her name except a deed to a broken cabin on 9 acres of steep Appalachian timber nobody wanted. I put my shoulder into that door one more time. It gave. Cold air came out first. Then the smell. Wood and stone and something older underneath. Something that had been waiting in those walls a long time. I stood in the doorway and looked at the dark room. Sagging floor, stained ceiling, 2 windows facing east gray light coming through. Every reasonable voice in my head said, "Turn around." I stepped inside. I didn't know yet that my grandmother had hidden something in this cabin for 59 years. Didn't know about the 4 acres that didn't exist on any county map. Didn't know what was buried under the second stone at Cutter's Fork. Didn't know she'd been waiting for me specifically. She was right to wait. This was the 23rd of January, 2020. 8 months since the divorce was finalized. 3 months since I'd cleared out my desk at the accounting firm in Nashville and driven out of the parking garage for the last time, with 2 boxes of personal items and a fern that died before I hit the interstate. My grandmother had died in November. I hadn't cried at the funeral. Not because I didn't love her, because I was so hollowed out by that point that grief couldn't find purchase. It just slid off me like everything else was sliding off me. Margaret Whitfield. Mags to everyone who knew her. 89 years old. Died in her sleep, the death certificate said. In the cabin she'd lived in alone since 1971. She left it to me. Not to my mother, not to my Aunt Ruth Ann, who'd driven 4 hours to the funeral and spent most of the reception talking about property values. Not to my cousin Darren, who'd asked the lawyer about the land twice before we'd even gotten back from the cemetery. To me, Conrad Reith had said it with the particular gentleness of a man delivering news he expected to be unwelcome. He sat behind a desk in a beige office in Elizabethton that smelled like printer toner and old coffee, and he said the word liability twice. He said burden once. He slid a release form across the desk with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd done this before and expected it to take 5 minutes. I looked at the form. I looked at him. I said I needed to see it first. He had not expected that. Now I was standing in the doorway of 9 acres of steep Appalachian timber and a cabin that the January cold had gotten into so thoroughly that my breath showed in the air inside, which told me something about the insulation before I'd looked at a single wall. The cabin was roughly 18 by 22 feet. One room, stone chimney on the north end. Two windows facing east gray winter light coming through glass that hadn't been cleaned in years. A rope cot in the corner. A cast iron stove near the chimney. A workbench along the west wall with a hand crank grinder bolted to the edge. I walked in. The floor gave under my right boot. Not catastrophically, not through to the ground, but the top layer of pine planking laid over the original subfloor at some point in the last 30 years compressed softly under my weight, like it had already given up on its structural responsibilities. I shifted my weight slowly, like probing ice. Tested the next board, solid. The one after, soft. I walked the full perimeter of the room that way, moving careful, weight forward, heels light. About a third of the surface layer was compromised. Not all in the same way. Some boards gave slightly. Some gave more than slightly. One near the east wall, close to the base of the chimney, had gone the color of dark tobacco and came apart in fibers when I pressed it with my boot. Moisture from the wall. I looked up. Two stains on the ceiling, both near the north end where the chimney met the roof line. Old water lines going back years. Each one a record of a season the roof had failed in the same spot. Two separate leaks, which meant two separate failures, which meant this wasn't a missing shingle situation. I stood there in my grandfather's old canvas coat, the one I'd taken from his closet years ago, because no one else was going to want it. And I did the math. January, Carter County. First significant snowfall, usually late January, sometimes early February at this elevation. The cabin sat at roughly 4,200 feet on the eastern slope of Rand Mountain, about 11 miles by gravel road from the nearest town and 4 miles from the closest house with a year-round occupant. If the roof failed under snow load, I'd lose the interior. If the floor continued to deteriorate, I'd lose safe movement through the cabin. If the chimney didn't draw, I'd lose heat. All three of those were this week problems. I had $212 in my checking account. A 2003 Civic with brake pads that made a sound I was choosing not to think about. A sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees that I'd bought at a Goodwill in Cookeville for $11, and approximately nothing else. I sat down on the workbench, slowly testing it first. It held. Good. Something held. I had driven up the gravel road twice before getting out and walking the last half mile. Because I wasn't confident the car could make the final switchback without the front end dropping into the ditch. I'd carried what I had. Sleeping bag, a thermos with the last of the morning's coffee, a folding knife on my belt that had been my grandfather's, a canvas pack with maybe 4 days of food if I was strategic about it. That was everything. I was 34 years old, and that was everything. The attorney had said liability. He'd said burden. He'd said it the way people say things when they already know what you're going to do and are trying to save everyone time. But here was the thing Conrad Reith didn't know. I had nowhere else to go. Not in the way people say that when they mean they're tired. In the literal, geographical, practical sense. The apartment in Nashville was gone. The job was gone. My ex-husband was currently living in the house we'd owned together with a woman who did hot yoga and had very nice hair and had apparently been doing hot yoga for about 14 months longer than I'd known about. So, the cabin. The chimney was the first thing that mattered. If it didn't draw, nothing else was worth discussing. I found a length of baling wire on the window ledge, stiff with rust, but workable. Bent a hook into one end and fed it up through the firebox as far as my arm would reach. It caught something. I worked it for 10 minutes. Angling the wire, adjusting the hook. A brick dropped into the firebox. Then a column of cold air came down from above, which meant the flue was open. I used 3 pieces of split wood from a stack I found against the north wall. Dry and old bark crumbled off, stacked low against the stone away from the moisture in the walls by someone who'd known exactly what they were doing. I built a small fire, nothing ambitious, just enough to test the draw. The smoke lifted, pulled clean, went up and disappeared the way it was supposed to. I stood back and watched it for a moment. Then I went outside to check the chimney cap. From the ground, I could see the stone cap had shifted. One edge lifted by freeze and thaw. Enough to let weather in, but not enough to block the flue entirely. That explained the loose brick. Easy enough to repoint if I had mortar. I had Portland cement in the car. My grandmother's notes left with the attorney's paperwork had said, "Bring it," had underlined it twice. I hadn't understood why until right now. I walked the perimeter of the cabin next, crouching at the foundation, pressing my palm flat against the base logs. 6 were solid. 2 on the northeast corner had softness in them, not rot through, but the outer inch gave slightly under pressure. The wood had gone gray and fibrous, worth watching. I stood up, looked at the roof from the ground. The pitch was steep, a 9/12 slope at minimum. The north side dropped away through the timber to nothing. I'd need a rope system to get up there safely, and I'd need to do it before the week was out. I went back inside and fed the fire another piece of that old dry wood. Then I found a stub of pencil in the coat pocket and made a list. Roof first, chimney cap second, foundation corner third, water source fourth, firewood fifth. The list had a shape before I even found paper to write it on. I wrote it in the margin of a water-stained field guide to Appalachian edible plants that was sitting on the shelf near the stove. Published 1971. Someone had dog-eared a page near the back. Ramps, identification and preparation. I wrote the date at the top. January 23rd, 2020. The light through the east windows was already going low. I had maybe 2 hours before dark. I ate half a tin of beans, cold, standing at the window, watching the tree line go dark from the bottom up, the way it does in a hollow when the ridge blocks the last of the sun. Then I banked the fire the way my grandmother had shown me once years ago, when I was small enough that the stove looked enormous, enough to hold coals through the night without burning through the wood supply before morning. I spread my sleeping bag on the rope cot in the corner. The smell in the room was wood smoke and cold and something underneath I couldn't name yet. I lay there listening to the mountain settle. I woke before light, not gradually, just awake. The way you get in a new place when every sound arrives without a frame of reference to cushion it. Something was dripping. I lay still and mapped it. 2 drips a pause, then 3 more hitting what sounded like the floorboards near the east wall. I reached out and felt the sleeping bag. Dry. I counted the intervals until they made sense. Rain. Or melt off the roof working through the shingles. I noted it. I did not get up. By the time gray light started at the windows, it was just past 6. I could see my breath. The fire had held. I fed it 2 splits from the wood pile and pulled on my boots and the wool overshirt I'd been sleeping in. The drip was coming from the northeast corner of the loft above. A dark stain ran down from the ceiling log, maybe 14 inches. The boards below it were darker than the rest. Not new damage. The stain had layers. Old water lines going back years, each one a record of a season the roof had failed in the same spot. Somebody had known about this. Whoever had lived here last had known, and either couldn't fix it or had stopped caring. I climbed the ladder to the loft. Low ceiling. I had to duck under the ridgeline. Smell of something dry and close. Mouse sign and old cloth. There was a mattress tick up there, straw stuffed and collapsed to almost nothing, and a wooden crate on its side that someone had used as a shelf. A kerosene lantern with a cracked chimney, a pair of wool trousers folded over a nail in the rafter, and at the far end, where the pitch of the roof came down to meet the floor, a loose board that someone had pried up and set back without nailing. Not settling, set back deliberately. I looked at the roof first because that was the problem with the deadline. 2 shingles had slipped. Cedar hand split the kind you could still make yourself if you had the wood and the tools. The gap between them was maybe 3 fingers wide. Water was tracking down the sheathing board underneath and finding the wall log. The fix wasn't complicated. What was complicated was getting up on a 9/12 pitch roof in January with what I had. I came back down the ladder, thinking about the loose board. The roof had to come first. But the board stayed in my mind the way a half-heard word will, asking to be finished. I spent the rest of that day walking the timber on the east-facing slope below the cabin, looking for a cedar with enough girth to split clean. My grandmother had used eastern red cedar for the original shingles. I could tell by the grain and the smell where the old wood was still exposed. Sharp, medicinal, like something between camphor and rain. I found 3 cedars within a quarter mile that might work. Marked them with a strip of cloth torn from the hem of an old curtain I'd found hanging off the workbench. Went back before the light went. That night, the temperature dropped to 27 degrees. I know because of a thermometer nailed outside the window. A Taylor glass tube red alcohol column still reading true. 27. Not killing cold. Not yet. A warning. The next morning, I cut the smallest of the 3 cedars with a bow saw I found in the lean-to shed on the south side of the cabin. I limbed the tree where it fell. The trunk was 14 inches across at the base. I blocked it into 18-inch rounds, which took most of the morning and left my shoulders feeling like wrung cloth. Then I found the froe, hanging on a peg in the lean-to shed. Old tool, handle replaced at least once with a piece of ash that someone had shaped by hand with a draw knife. You could still see the flat facets where the blade had tracked. The blade itself was stamped with a maker's mark I couldn't fully read. 2 letters and what might have been a date. I set the blade against the first cedar round and hit the back of it with a mallet. The wood opened along the grain like it wanted to come apart that way. Clean. Fast. The smell rising sharp in the cold air. By late afternoon, I had 34 shingles. I needed maybe 12 to do the repair properly. The extras I stacked in the shed, cut side down off the ground. I had 40 feet of 3/8-inch manila rope coiled on a peg in the same shed, still supple no rot I could find. I tied one end around the base of a red oak that stood close enough to the cabin's ridge to be useful. Threw the coil over. It caught on the ridge board and draped down both sides. The next morning, I went up. I will not pretend it wasn't frightening. The pitch was steeper from the surface than it looked from the ground. The shingles were slick from overnight frost, and the north side dropped away through the timber to a slope that wanted to pull me with it. I moved slow, both hands on the rope, weight distributed. I found the gap in under 10 minutes because I knew exactly where to look from the interior staining. 2 shingles slipped, both loose at the nails. The sheathing beneath was dark with old water, but intact. I fitted the new cedar shingles into place and nailed them down with the hand-claw hammer I'd carried up in my coat pocket. Then I checked the surrounding shingles, found 2 more that were borderline, fixed those 2 while I was up there. Coming back down the rope arms, shaking fingers numb inside my gloves, I felt something close to satisfaction. The specific kind that comes from doing a thing with your hands that needed doing. Not pride. Something quieter than pride. More like relief that your body still worked. That you could still be useful. I'd forgotten that feeling. I hadn't realized until that moment on that roof how long I'd been forgetting it. That afternoon, she came back. I heard the truck before I saw it. A sound that didn't belong to the mountain working up the gravel road in low gear. I came around the corner of the cabin with the hammer still in my hand and watched a rust-colored pickup stop at the edge of the clearing. The woman who got out was about 68 years old, maybe 5'4". Gray hair pinned up in a way that had probably started neat that morning and had since made its own decisions. She was wearing a canvas barn coat over a flannel shirt, and she moved with the deliberate, unhurried purpose of someone who had never once wasted a step. She was carrying a paper bag in one arm and a small box of nails in the other hand. She set both of them on the porch step without a word. I said, "You were here before, 2 days ago." She said, I said, "You left food." She said, "You look like you needed it." I looked at the paper bag, potatoes, a jar of something dark red, 2 eggs wrapped in newspaper. I said, "I'm Hazel. Mags was my grandmother." She said, "I know who you are." Then she looked at me in the way older women sometimes look at you when they're not just seeing you, but measuring something, taking stock. The kind of look that has years of practice behind it and doesn't apologize for what it finds. She said you'd come. Said you'd be the last one they'd think to watch. I didn't know what that meant. I wanted to ask, but something in the way she said it made me feel like asking too fast would be the wrong move. Like there was a pace to this conversation that she had already set, and I was going to have to match it or lose something. I said, "What's your name?" She said, "Cece Drummond. I'm about 4 miles down the East Road. You need anything, you know where to look." Then she turned and got back in the truck. I stood there holding the box of nails and watched the rust-colored pickup back down the gravel drive. She said you'd come. Said you'd be the last one they'd think to watch. I turned those 2 sentences over for the rest of the afternoon while I worked on the foundation corners, pressing my palm against the northeast base logs, checking the softness. Not through. Not yet. But the outer wood had gone gray and fibrous, and I needed to shore it up before snow loaded the roof above it. I ate a tin of sardines and half the jar of something dark red, which turned out to be pickled beets, which I had never in my life voluntarily eaten, and which were, I had to admit, not bad when you were cold and hungry and your arms hurt from climbing a roof. That night, I banked the fire low and climbed up the loft ladder. The loose board was still there, sitting in the far end of the loft where the pitch came down to the floor, set back without nails, deliberate. I'd been thinking about it since I found it that first morning, and I'd been putting it off because the roof had a deadline and the board would keep. I set my lantern down beside it, looked at it for a long moment. Then I worked my fingers under the near edge and lifted. The cavity beneath was dry. Whatever moisture had gotten into the rest of the loft over the decades hadn't reached here. About 8 inches deep, the width of 2 joists. There was a cloth bundle inside. Canvas, the old waxed kind, tied with leather lace gone stiff and dark. Beside it, a glass jar with a metal lid sealed with wax around the rim. And under both of those lying flat against the rough-cut subfloor, a notebook, composition style, black cover with a marbled gray pattern, corners soft with age. I took the notebook out first, no writing on the cover. I opened to the first page and held the lantern close. 2 different handwritings. The first was small and deliberate. The letters formed with the careful spacing of someone who didn't write often, but took it seriously when they did. The ink had gone brown. A date at the top, March 4th, 1947, and below it, 1 line. If you're reading this, you already know the place. Take care of it. That was all on the first page. The second handwriting began about 20 pages in, looser, slightly larger. The letters tilted right as though written quickly. The ink was newer, darker, a ballpoint that had bled slightly into the aging paper. The date at the top of that section, September 12th, 1971. I made it through the winter. I want to write that plainly. I made it through. The floor held. The chimney drew. The spring didn't go dry. I split more wood than I thought I could, and when February came, I had enough to spare. I want to remember that feeling. I don't want to make it sound like more than it was, but I want to remember. I turned pages slowly. The first handwriting, the 1947 entries, were practical, dimensions of the cabin annotated with pencil. Where the spring ran. How deep the well went, and what month it usually went low. Where the soil was too thin for a proper garden, and where it wasn't. A note about the north wall. Check the sill log every spring. Water comes off the roof wrong there. A note about the stove, damper sticks in cold weather. Pull and rotate. My great-grandfather. He'd built this cabin. He'd written a manual for living in it. The second handwriting was my grandmother's. I knew it from her letters. She'd written me letters all through my 20s, long ones, full of specific observations about the mountain and the season and whatever she was thinking about. I'd kept all of them in a shoebox under my bed in Nashville, and I'd brought that shoebox with me. It was in the car. Same handwriting. Mags had written in her father's notebook for 48 years. I sat with my back against the loft wall and read until the lantern started to dim. The notebook had pages of weather observations, notes about game, the behavior of the creek in hard rain. It was not a diary. It was closer to a manual for living in this specific place, written by two people who had learned it the way I was starting to learn it. One winter at a time. I did not open the canvas bundle that night. I set the notebook on the shelf beside my things and climbed down to bank the stove. Some things want to wait until morning. Morning came in gray and slow, the light arriving at the east window like it wasn't sure it was welcome. I could see my breath. The stove had burned down to ash. I dressed where I stood. Both layers of wool. Then got the fire going again with cedar splits stacked against the wall. While the stove found its heat, I looked at the canvas bundle on the workbench where I'd carried it down the night before. I made coffee first. The hand crank grinder bolted to the wall beside the window. Dark roast from a paper bag I'd brought up from the feed store in town, boiled in the old blue enamel pot. Then I sat at the table with the mug and looked at the bundle and let the stove do its work. Then I opened the notebook to a section I hadn't reached the night before, about 20 pages from the back, my grandmother's handwriting. But the letters were less controlled here, larger, like written in poor light or cold hands. Found the surveyor's marks today. southeast corner of the parcel, 30 yards past the big hemlock that was struck twice. The line doesn't run where the county says it runs. I read it twice. Below it, one more sentence. The difference is about 4 acres, and what's on those 4 acres is why I never filed the correction. I set the notebook down with my finger holding the page. Outside, the wind came off the ridge and ran along the eaves. The stovepipe hummed one low note and went quiet. 4 acres. A line that didn't match the county record. A reason kept quiet long enough that the woman who knew it was gone. I turned the page. A sketch. Quick lines. The kind a person makes to fix something in their memory before the light goes. A rough rectangle for the cabin. North marked with an arrow. A dotted line running southeast from a point labeled Big Hemlock double-struck angling through an area marked wet ground ending at a small circle. The 4 acres were shaded with cross-hatching. Inside the cross-hatching, 3 symbols. One looked like a horizontal ladder. The second was a simple square with a dot at the center. The third was the letter S, circled twice. I didn't know what any of them meant. I turned another page. The seam runs northeast to southwest, maybe 60 feet exposed at the surface where the slide took the hillside in '61. Cecil saw it first. We both understood what it meant. I showed the essay report to no one. I paid the surveyor in cash and told him the correction wasn't necessary. He understood. Men like him always understand when cash is involved and no questions are asked. I got up and put another piece of wood in the stove without thinking about it. My hands did the work. My eyes stayed on the notebook. What's in that ground isn't a fortune. I want to be clear about that, but it is enough. Enough that someone with a deed and a good attorney could make a case that would take years and cost more than I'll ever have. So I left the line where the county put it. 4 acres outside the parcel on paper. 4 acres nobody else knows to look at. A full blank line. She'd never done that in all the pages I'd read. Then, if you're reading this, you came with the deed. That means I trusted you enough to leave it to you. The canvas bundle will explain the rest. I closed the notebook. Looked at the canvas bundle, heavier than cloth should be. I worked the leather cord loose, unrolled the canvas flat on the table. Inside a folded paper brittle at the creases, and underneath it a small glass vial stopped with a waxed cork holding something dark and grainy that caught the lamplight and held it. I unfolded the paper first. A map, hand-drawn in the same pencil as the notebook. The paper had gone amber at the edges. Fold lines nearly separated. I spread it flat and weighted the corners with the vial, the lantern base, my coffee cup, and my thumb. The mountain was there. I recognized the ridgeline immediately. The way the south face dropped faster than the north. The creek that ran through the lower hollow. My grandmother had labeled it Cutter's Fork, which matched the county map I'd found folded in the glove box of my car. The cabin was marked, a square with a dot inside. a line running northeast toward the tree line ending at a symbol. Two crossed lines with a small circle at the center. A datum point, a fixed reference stake. And off the datum, a second line shorter running due east, ending at a filled circle, pressed hard into the paper. Below it, 4 words in my grandmother's handwriting. Below the second stone. I sat back. I picked up the vial and held it to the lamp. The dark material inside shifted when I tilted it. Dense, heavier than soil. Flat metallic sheen when the light caught it straight on. I pulled the waxed cork out carefully, tipped the smallest amount onto my palm. Heavy for its size, color somewhere between dark rust and black. Individual grains, angular, irregular, not rounded like river sand. I pressed one grain between my thumbnail and the pad of my finger. It didn't compress. It didn't smear. It held its shape. I poured it back into the vial and pressed the cork in. Sat there for a long time. Then I stood up, put on my boots, the wool overshirt, the canvas coat. There was a name in the corner of the map I hadn't looked at closely before. Small, almost incidental, like an afterthought or like something added later. C. Drummond. I held the lantern closer. C. Drummond. C.C. Drummond. 4 miles down the East Road. Who had shown up twice without being asked? Who had known my grandmother? Who had said she said you'd come, like it was something that had been discussed, like it had been planned? The woman who'd handed me a box of nails and walked away. Her name was on my grandmother's map. I stood at the workbench for a long moment with the map in my hands and the vial in my coat pocket and the cold coming off the north wall and the fire clicking behind me. Then I rolled the map carefully and tucked it inside the notebook and climbed back up the loft ladder and put both of them back under the loose board and pressed it down flat. Not because I was afraid, because some things want to wait until you're ready, and I was not ready yet. That night, I lay on the cot and listened to the mountain and thought about 4 acres that weren't on any county map and a name written in a corner that shouldn't have been there. I thought about what my grandmother had written. She left it to the one who never asked what it was worth. I hadn't asked. That was true. I'd never asked because I'd never imagined she'd leave it to me. I'd never thought of myself as the one anyone would choose. Maybe that was the point. Maybe that was exactly the point. The fire ticked and settled. Somewhere up on the slope, a branch cracked. The clean, sharp crack of something with weight moving through dry timber. I stayed still. The sound didn't repeat. I thought about my grandmother living here alone for 48 years, splitting her own wood, testing her own floors, keeping a secret in a loft, under a loose board, with the kind of patience that most people can't even imagine. Waiting for what? For who? I stared at the ceiling in the dark and listened to the mountain breathe. And somewhere between one breath and the next, I understood that the cabin wasn't a liability. It wasn't a burden. It was a question my grandmother had been asking for 48 years. And she had been waiting specifically and deliberately for me to come and answer it. Part 2. 4 acres and a silence. She didn't invite me in. I knocked on the door of the white farmhouse 4 miles down the east road, and Cece Drummond opened it, looked at me, looked at the notebook under my arm, and stepped back to let me through without a word, which was either very good or very bad. I hadn't decided yet. The inside of the house smelled like wood smoke and something savory on the stove. A border collie lifted its head from a rug near the fireplace, decided I wasn't interesting, and put its head back down. The kitchen table had 3 chairs and a 4th one pushed against the wall with a stack of seed catalogs on the seat. Cece moved to the stove, lifted the lid on a pot, replaced it, said, "Sit down." I sat. She poured 2 mugs of coffee without asking whether I wanted any. Set one in front of me, sat across the table with her hands wrapped around her own mug, and looked at me with that measuring look she'd used at the cabin. I put the notebook on the table, opened to the page with the sketch, the dotted line, the cross-hatching, the 3 symbols, and the name in the corner. C. Drummond. She looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then she said, "How far did you read?" I said, "Far enough to know about the 4 acres, and the seam, and somebody named Cecil." Something moved across her face. Not surprise, more like a door opening that had been closed a long time. She said Cecil Drummond was my father. I waited. He and your grandmother found it together. Spring of 1961. There'd been a small slide on the southeast face the previous autumn. Took out maybe 40 feet of hillside, exposed the rock underneath. She paused, drank her coffee. They weren't looking for anything. They were just walking the property line after the slide, checking the drainage. I said, "But they found it."
Cecil knew what it was. He'd done some mining work up in Virginia when he was young. Knew what that kind of rock meant. They didn't say anything at first. Mags went to the county office in Elizabethton and got the parcel survey. Realized the 4 acres where the seam was exposed sat just outside her recorded property line. She set her mug down, just outside, by maybe 30 feet of paper. I said, "So the county map was wrong."
The county map was old, done in the 20s. The surveyor who did it was working off compass bearings and chain measurements in heavy timber. Errors happened. She looked at the notebook again. A correction would have put those 4 acres inside Mags's parcel, legally and cleanly. She had the right to file it. But she didn't. No. Because of what happened to your father. The border collie shifted on its rug. The pot on the stove sent up a small sound. Cece's hands stayed still around her mug. She said, "They hired an assayer out of Kingsport to come look. Independent man, or so they thought. He came, he looked, he took samples, sent his report to my father and Mags 3 weeks later. She paused. Sent a copy to a company out of Knoxville 2 weeks before that. There it was. I said, before he told them. Before he told them. Her voice was flat. The flatness of someone who had said a thing so many times internally that the saying of it out loud had lost its texture. A man came to see my father in October of '61, offered to buy the property. My father said no. The man came back in November. My father said no again. She looked at her hands. The week before Christmas, my father's truck went off Route 19 coming down from Unicoi County. Icy road, the report said. Single vehicle. The sheriff at the time ruled it an accident. I said nothing, because there was nothing to say. I was 10 years old, she said. I remember the day the deputy came to the door. I remember exactly what he was wearing, what time of day it was, the way the light looked. She picked up her mug, put it down again without drinking. Mags never believed it was an accident. She couldn't prove otherwise. She was a woman alone on a mountain in 1961 in Carter County, Tennessee. What was she going to do? Not a question, a statement, the kind that holds decades of knowing inside it. I looked at the notebook on the table. My grandmother, 89 years old, died in her sleep in November. Said no to a man from a company in October. 6 weeks later, I said she wrote that she told someone no 3 times in 30 years, him and his father before him. Cece said, the company changed names twice. The people behind it didn't change. I said, Conrad Reith. She said, Conrad Rath's client, not the man himself, the man behind the man. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, the name on the map, your name. Why did she put it there? Cece was quiet for a moment. Then she said, because I was the witness. If anything ever happened to her before she could pass it on, I was supposed to find a way to make sure whoever came with the deed found the map and found the notebook and found everything she'd been keeping. She looked at me directly. She wrote me a letter, kept it in the kitchen drawer, said if she didn't make it to spring, I'd know why. Said to wait for you. Wait for Hazel. I thought about my grandmother sitting in this cabin alone, October turning cold. A man coming up the gravel road in a car that cost more than her truck, knocking on that swollen door, saying no. For the 3rd time in 30 years. And then 6 weeks later, she was gone. I pressed my hands flat on the table and breathed. Cece said, she didn't tell me everything, only what I needed to know to protect it until you came. The rest she left for you to find. I said, the 2nd stone. She said, I don't know what that is. And I believed her. I drove back up the mountain with the notebook on the passenger seat and the vial in my coat pocket, and something sitting in my chest that wasn't grief exactly, but was in the neighborhood of it. The weight of understanding something too late, of realizing the shape of what someone carried while they were carrying it. My grandmother had lived with this for 59 years, not paralyzed by it, not broken by it. Living, splitting wood, tending a garden, writing in a notebook, keeping a secret in a loft under a loose board, waiting for the one who wouldn't ask what it was worth. I parked at the bottom of the switchback and walked the last half mile in the cold. The gravel crunched under my boots. The ridge above was clear, no clouds, the kind of February sky that's so blue it almost doesn't look real. Below the second stone, I had the map. I had the landmark descriptions. The bent pine, the gravel shelf where the bank flattened out. Cutter's Fork ran about 60 yards south of the cabin, down through the hollow, in a cut that narrowed in summer and opened in snowmelt. I'd walked that bank a dozen times since I arrived. Gathering my bearings, learning the property. I hadn't known what I was walking past. I went inside first, fed the fire, changed into dry wool socks because wet feet in February on a Tennessee mountain is a problem that compounds quickly. Then I took the map and the lantern and went back outside and down through the hemlock stand toward the creek. The bent pine was exactly where she'd drawn it. A lodgepole that had taken a snow load years ago and grown sideways from the injury, angling hard toward the water like it was trying to drink. Still living, still reaching. 30 feet northeast, I counted the steps, found the gravel shelf where the bank flattened, and there were 2 stones, side by side, same size, same gray-green color. The kind of stones a creek makes common, the kind you'd step over without a thought. I stood there looking at them for a moment. Then I got on my knees on the cold bank, set the lantern on a dry patch, and worked my fingers under the second stone. Heavier than it looked. I rocked it toward me. It came free of the mud with a slow sucking sound. Set it aside. Underneath was a clay depression, maybe 6 inches across, packed smooth at the edges. But the center was drier than it should have been. I pressed my fingers in, hit something solid at about 3 inches. I pulled out a folded piece of oilcloth, bound tight, wrapped with a strip of leather lacing, threaded through a small brass grommet. I sat back on my heels and held it in both hands. Maybe the size of a small book, heavier than it looked, cold from the ground. I worked the knot loose with my folding knife, careful not to cut the lacing. Inside the oilcloth was a second vial, larger than the first, filled to the waxed cork with the same dark angular material, and beneath it folded once, still dry, a half-page of paper in my grandmother's handwriting, the letters leaning hard to the right, written in a hurry or in poor light. If you found this, you either came with the deed or you earned it. Either way, it's yours now. Don't be in a hurry. The mountain doesn't reward hurry. I read it twice. Then I sat on the bank of Cutter's Fork, with the cold working through my jeans at the knee and the creek running past my boots, and held both vials, one in each hand. The dark, angular crystals caught the gray February light and threw it back at a different angle. Graphite doesn't do that. Mica doesn't do that quite that way. I didn't know what they were. Not for certain. Not yet. But I knew they were the reason my grandmother had kept 4 acres off a county map for 59 years. I wrapped them both in the oilcloth and put them in my chest pocket and buttoned the flap. Then I walked back up the hollow. Millstone College was 45 minutes east of Elizabethton on a state road that wound through timber country before opening up into the small college town of Linden, Tennessee. The geology department was in a brick building at the northwest corner of campus, the kind of building that had been added onto twice and showed it. I had called ahead. The department secretary had connected me to Professor Aldine Marsh. No relation to Cece, just the same common Carter County surname. Professor Marsh taught introductory geology and upper division mineralogy, and had been at Millstone for 22 years. Her office smelled like old journals and coffee, and had a window that looked out onto a parking lot, which she had decorated with a row of potted cacti in an apparent act of defiance against the Tennessee climate. I set both vials on her desk. She picked up the larger one, held it to the light, turned it slowly. Then she looked at me, said, "Where did you find this?" I said, "My grandmother's property in Carter County." She said, "How much of it is there?" I said, "I don't know." She uncorked the vial with the careful attention of someone who has handled fragile things for 22 years and tipped a small amount onto a glass plate on her desk. Put on a magnifying loupe, leaned forward. The office was very quiet. Then she sat back and took off the loupe and looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. She said, "This is rhodonite. High grade. The crystal structure is exceptionally clean. You don't usually see it like this in Tennessee formations." I said, "What's it worth?" She said, "That depends entirely on how much there is and how accessible the seam is. But I can tell you that a high-grade rhodonite deposit of any significant size would be of considerable interest to industrial mineral markets. Gemstone quality, too, at this grade." I said, "How considerable?" She said, "If the seam runs the way the sample suggests, and if the exposure is what I'd expect given the regional geology." She paused, chose her words with precision. "We're not talking about someone's retirement fund. We're talking about the kind of figure that attracts serious commercial attention." I looked at the vial, the dark angular crystals. My grandmother had known what this was since 1961. 60 years. She had sat on this for 60 years, not because she was foolish, not because she didn't understand what it meant, because she understood exactly what it meant. And she'd watched what happened to Cecil Drummond when he tried to hold on to something a company wanted. I said, if someone wanted to extract it commercially, they'd need the land rights. Professor Marsh said, they'd need the land rights. I drove back to the cabin, parked at the bottom of the switchback, walked the half-mile in the cold. The cabin was exactly as I'd left it. Door closed, smoke rising thin from the chimney. The cedar shingles on the roof patch already weathering gray at the edges the way cedar does, blending in. I stood in the clearing for a moment. 9 acres. 4 of them not on any county map. One of them sitting on a mineral deposit that a company had been circling for 60 years, like a dog that can smell something through a locked door. I went inside and fed the stove and made coffee and sat at the table with both vials and the map and the notebook and tried to think clearly. 3 days later, Conrad Reith drove up the gravel road. I heard his car before I saw it. Not a truck, a sedan, dark green. Expensive enough to be noticeable, but not so expensive as to be flashy. The kind of car a careful man drives. He was about 58 years old. Silver hair neatly cut. A good wool coat over a button-down shirt and slacks that were not appropriate for a gravel road in February, but were making their best effort. He was carrying 2 paper cups from what I assumed was the coffee shop in town. He held one out toward me, said, Ms. Voss. Conrad Reith. We met briefly in Elizabethton after your grandmother's passing. I said, I remember. He said, I hope you don't mind me coming up. I tried to call, but the signal out here is unreliable. I said, What do you need, Mr. Reith? He smiled, the kind of smile that's been practiced until it looks natural. He said, I wanted to follow up on our conversation from January. I represent a client who has expressed interest in the property. Given the back taxes owed and the cost of bringing the structures up to code, my client is prepared to make a generous offer for the full parcel. I said, How generous? He said a number. It was a real number, not insulting, not enormous. The kind of number that would pay off what remained of my divorce settlement and get me a deposit on a decent apartment somewhere, and maybe leave a little over. The kind of number that would solve the immediate problem very cleanly. He was watching my face. I kept it still. I said, What does your client want with 9 acres of steep timber in Carter County? He said, My client has interests in Appalachian land conservation, acquiring and protecting undeveloped parcels. Land conservation. Sure, I said, I'll think about it. He said, Of course, take your time. He handed me the coffee cup. The offer stands through the end of the month. He walked back to his dark green sedan, turned the car around in the clearing with the precise 3-point efficiency of someone who had done it before, drove down the gravel road. I stood there holding the paper cup and watching the car disappear. Land conservation. I poured the coffee out into the snow. Before Conrad Reith came up that road, I had driven to the county courthouse in Elizabethton and spent 4 hours in the records room with a woman named Donna, who smelled like lavender hand lotion and had an encyclopedic knowledge of Carter County property filings going back to 1940. Donna had not been asked to find anything specific. I had just asked to see filings associated with exploration permits on the eastern slope of Ran Mountain. She'd found 3, all associated with Meridian Extraction LLC. All 3 applications listed the same legal representative, Conrad Reith. That evening, I called Cece from the cabin's landline. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "Conrad Reith came up today." She said, "What did he offer?" I told her the number. She said, "That's low." I said, "I know." She said, "He knows you know it's low." I said, "He thinks I'm desperate enough not to care." She said, "Are you?" I thought about the $212 in my checking account, the brake pads, the floorboards that still needed proper repair. February turning into March with the wood pile lower than I wanted it. I said, "Not yet." Cece made a sound that might have been approval. I said, "He said land conservation." She said, "Meridian's been saying different things for 60 years. It's the same company, just different words." I said, "Cece, your father's report, the essay from 61, does anything like that still exist?" A pause. She said, "Come over tomorrow." I went the next morning, walked the 4 miles because the road was icy enough that I didn't trust the Civic on the east grade. My boots were good. My grandmother's canvas coat was good, and I'd learned in the past month that a 4-mile walk in cold air was something my body could do, something it was even getting accustomed to. Cece met me at the door with a key in her hand. Not a modern key, an old one. Long shaft ornate bow, the kind made for a chest or a strong box. She said, "My mother kept everything my father left behind. Every paper, every document. She didn't trust banks, and she didn't trust attorneys, and she kept it all in a cedar chest in the back bedroom." She held the key out toward me. "I haven't opened it since she passed, 12 years ago." I took the key. She said, "You do it, I'll be in the kitchen." The cedar chest was at the foot of the bed in the back bedroom of the farmhouse. A good piece of furniture, maybe 4 feet long. The cedar smell came off it even before I opened it, sharp and clean. The key fit the lock with the smooth certainty of 2 things made for each other. I lifted the lid. Inside, arranged with the careful deliberateness of a woman who expected someone to need to find things, were papers, envelopes, folded documents, a small stack of photographs held with a rubber band that had gone brittle and broke when I touched it, letters tied with kitchen twine, and near the bottom in a manila envelope sealed with electrical tape and labeled in a handwriting I didn't recognize, "Assay Report. Cutter's Fork, 1961. I opened it slowly. Inside was the original report. 6 pages typewritten with handwritten annotations in the margins in what I assumed was Cecil's handwriting. The report named the mineral, rhodonite, high-grade industrial and gemstone quality. It estimated the exposed seam at approximately 60 feet and noted significant probability of additional depth. Below the mineral assessment in the summary section, the assayer had written, "Commercial extraction potential warranting further investment. Estimated surface yield sufficient for profitable single-operator extraction. Subsurface survey recommended." At the bottom of the last page, the assayer's signature and a date. October 3rd, 1961. Cecil Drummond's truck went off Route 19 on December 18th, 1961. 11 weeks later. There was something else in the manila envelope. A single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, handwriting I didn't know. I unfolded it. It was a letter, written to Cecil. Brief. 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph restated the offer. A number. The second paragraph said the offer was time-sensitive and that Cecil's decision should be made with the full understanding of the risks involved in holding a property of this nature without proper legal protection. That sentence. The risks involved. The third paragraph closed with a name and a title. Harlan Pickett, Carter County Land Management Office. I stood in that bedroom for a long time. Harlan Pickett, Sheriff Dale Pickett's father. The sheriff who had ruled Cecil Drummond's death and accident in December of 1961 was the same man who had written Cecil a letter in October of 1961, warning him about the risks of not selling. I folded the letter back into thirds, put it back in the envelope, took the entire envelope to the kitchen where Cece was sitting with her coffee looking out the window at the bare winter tree line. I set it on the table in front of her. She looked at it, said, "You found it." I said, "Did you know about the letter?" She said, "My mother told me about it. She never showed it to me. She was afraid that if I saw it, I'd do something that would get me hurt." She put her hand flat on the envelope. She was probably right. I said, "Harlan Pickett wrote your father a letter warning him about the risks of not selling. 11 weeks later, your father was dead." She said, "And Dale Pickett has been sheriff of Carter County for 23 years. We sat with that. The border collie came in from the other room and put its chin on Cece's knee. She put her hand on its head without looking down. I said, "There's something in the first vial I haven't told you yet." She looked up. I said, "My grandmother hid something else in there, below the mineral sample, a rag stuffed in the bottom of the vial. I pulled it out this morning." I reached into my coat pocket and put it on the table. A small roll of paper wrapped in a strip of cloth. Another note. Cece looked at it. I unrolled it. My grandmother's handwriting, compressed, dense, written like she was running out of room or running out of time. I know about Harlan Pickett. I have known since January 1962, when I found the letter in Cecil's truck. The truck they towed to the impound yard and left unlocked. I took the letter. I have kept it. If this reaches you, then I kept it long enough. The letter from Harlan Pickett to Cecil. My grandmother had had it the whole time. I looked at Cece. She was very still. I said, "She took it from the truck." Cece said, She never told me that. I said, she was protecting you. Cece made a sound, not quite a word, somewhere between a breath and something that had been held a long time. Then she said, "Where is it?" I said, "I don't know yet. The note says she kept it, which means it's in the cabin somewhere I haven't found." I stood up, walked to the window. Outside, the bare tree line held the gray February sky above it, still, waiting for something. Sheriff Dale Pickett, 23 years in office. His father's letter in a manila envelope in a cedar chest, and a woman who had known since 1962 and kept quiet because she was alone on a mountain, and what was she going to do? But she hadn't just kept quiet. She had kept the letter. She had made a map. She had put a name in the corner of the map. She had waited for the one person in her family who had never asked what the land was worth. And then, 3 days after saying "Mu" to Conrad Reith for the third time in 30 years, she was gone. I turned away from the window, said, "I need to go back and find the letter." Cece said, "Hazel." I said, "I know." She said, "Be careful." I said, "I know." I walked the 4 miles back to the cabin in the cold. Fast. The kind of walking that isn't about the destination as much as it's about needing to move. I went straight to the loft, lifted the loose board, took out the notebook, both files, the map, everything I'd found, laid it all on the workbench in the light from the east windows. Then I went back to the loft and looked at everything else up there. The mattress tick, the wooden crate, the kerosene lantern, the wool trousers on the nail. I checked the mattress first. Nothing. The crate. Nothing. The wool trousers. I put my hand in the pocket. A piece of paper folded into a tight square. Old. The crease lines brown with age. I unfolded it. It was not the letter. It was another note from my grandmother. Different handwriting. Older. The pen she used in the 80s, the way her letters had looked before arthritis started working on her hands. Read the first vial all the way to the bottom. I mean all the way. I went back down the ladder, took the first vial, the smaller one, pulled the cork, tipped all the mineral sample out onto the glass plate from my pack, and spread it thin. Then I looked at the vial with the lantern close. At the very bottom below, where the minerals had sat, was a tightly rolled piece of oilskin, thin as paper, dark with age. I used my knife to work it out, unrolled it on the table, and there it was. 1 page. Handwriting I now recognized as Harlan Pickett's. The same hand as the letter to Cecil, aged another 60 years and still unmistakable. The same 3 paragraphs. The same warning. The risks involved in holding a property of this nature. And at the bottom, the signature. Harlan Pickett, Carter County Land Management Office. October 1961. My grandmother had kept it for 59 years. At the bottom of a mineral vial under a loose floorboard in the loft of a cabin on 9 acres that nobody wanted. waiting for someone who wouldn't flinch. I sat at the workbench for a long time. The fire ticked behind me. The light through the east windows was going low. The temperature was dropping the way it does in February when the sun goes behind the ridge, sudden and decisive, like a door shutting. I had the essay report from Cecil's papers. I had my grandmother's note proving she'd known since January 1962. I had the original letter from Harlan Pickett. I had mineral samples from the deposit. I had 3 meridian extraction applications from the county records office. And I had a name on a map that told me C.C. Drummond had been waiting just as long as my grandmother had. 2 women, 2 generations, 60 years of keeping a secret, not because they were afraid, but because they were careful. Because they understood that the right time and the right person mattered. I put everything back, every paper, both vials, the map, the notebook, back under the loose board, pressed down flat. Then I went outside and stood in the clearing in the cold dark and looked up at the ridge. The stars were coming out, sharp and close the way they get at this elevation when the air is clear and cold. I stood there until I stopped shaking. Not from cold, from the anger of understanding what had been done and what had been endured, and how long. Then I went inside, because there was still one more thing to deal with. The knock came 2 mornings later. Not a car on the road, just boots on the porch step, and then a knock, the flat official knock of someone who does it the same way every time from 20 years of practice. I opened the door. Sheriff Dale Pickett was about 55 years old, medium height, a county sheriff's jacket over a pressed uniform, a face that had learned over a long career to give nothing away. He was standing with his hands easy at his sides and a look of practiced, friendly concern on his face. He said, "Morning, Ms. Voss. Hope I'm not disturbing you." I said, "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" He said, "Just checking in. Heard you'd been settling in up here. Wanted to make sure you didn't have any issues. Road conditions, property, security, anything like that." I said, "Everything's fine." He looked past me into the cabin. A quick look, professional, taking inventory without appearing to. He said, "Your grandmother was a fine woman, stubborn, but fine." He smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach anything. "You settling in for the long term, you think?" I said, "I think so." He said, "Good. Good." He looked around the clearing, at the wood pile, at the chimney, at the shed on the south side. "It's a lot of land for one person to manage." I said, "I'm managing." He looked back at me, said, "Conrad Reith's a good attorney. Good man. If you ever reconsidered his client's offer, nothing wrong with taking a fair price for something that's hard to maintain." There it was. I said, "I'll keep that in mind." He held my eyes for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandmother was a stubborn woman, Hazel. Stubborn women don't always get to finish what they start." He didn't finish the sentence. he didn't need to. He said, "You have a good day now," and turned and walked back across the clearing to where his truck was parked at the edge of the tree line. I hadn't heard it arrive, which meant he'd parked it on the road below and walked up, which meant he didn't want me to hear him coming. I stood in the doorway and watched him go. Then I went inside, sat at the table, picked up the coffee mug. My hands were completely steady. That surprised me, because what I felt inside wasn't fear. It was clarity. The clarity that comes when you understand exactly what something is. When you stop wondering and start knowing. My grandmother had sat in this cabin and felt this exact thing 60 years ago, alone, with no one to call and nowhere to go, and a company and a county sheriff's office working together against her. She had sat here, and she had stayed, and she had kept the letter, and she had waited for me. I put the mug down, stood up, picked up the landline, and called Cece. She answered on the first ring. I said, "Pickett was just here." She said, "I know. I saw his truck on the road." I said, "It's time." She said, "I know." I said, "I'm going to need a lawyer." She said, "I know someone, Asheville, environmental land law. She's good." I said, "Can she handle something like this?" Cece said, "She's been waiting for something like this her whole career." Outside, the ridge held the sky. The creek ran 60 yards south. The hemlock stand was still, quiet. The mountain was listening. Part 3. What You Don't Sell. The cabin looked different when I came back that afternoon. Not different in any way I could point to. Same walls, same stained ceiling, same east windows letting in the low March light that always arrived like it was apologizing for something. But different the way a room looks when you've been gone long enough to see it fresh. Someone had been inside. I knew it before I could explain why. Something about the air. Something about the arrangement of things on the workbench. The hand crank grinder had always sat at a slight angle handle turned left, the way I'd left it after using it. Now it sat straight. Small thing, maybe nothing, except it wasn't nothing. I stood in the doorway without going in and looked at the room the way you look at a place when you're trying to read it. Left to right, slow. The stove, the woodpile, the workbench, the table, the shelf near the chimney. The notebook was not where I kept it. I kept it on the second shelf spine out between the field guide and the tin of matches. Now it was lying flat on top of the field guide cover, up open. Open to the page with the sketch, the dotted line, the cross-hatching, the 3 symbols. I walked to the table and sat down without touching anything. Sat there in the cold cabin for a long moment with my hands flat on my knees. Somebody had come in, read the notebook, opened it to the map page, which meant they knew what they were looking for, which meant they'd been here before without me knowing, learning the cabin, learning where I kept things. I thought about Pickett walking across the clearing 2 mornings ago. His truck parked below the road so I wouldn't hear him coming. His eyes moving quick and professional over the shed, the woodpile, the chimney. Stubborn women don't always get to finish what they start. I went up the loft ladder, lifted the loose board. Everything was there. Both vials, the map, the real letter, all of it exactly as I'd left it under the board in the dark. They hadn't found the board, or if they had, they hadn't touched what was underneath, which meant they still didn't know exactly what I had. They just knew I had something. Good. Let them wonder. I came back down and looked at the notebook open on the shelf. They'd read the clue, but the stone was already empty. Whatever they thought they'd find there, it wasn't there anymore. I had both vials. I had the letter. I had everything my grandmother had hidden for 60 years. And I had an attorney in Asheville who was expecting my call. Her name was Renata Foss, Blue Ridge Land Defense. The kind of name and the kind of organization that sounded small and regional until you looked it up and found 17 successful actions against extractive industry companies in 4 states over 12 years. A staff of 9 attorneys and a waiting list for intake. Cece had her cell number. I called it that night from the landline. She answered on the 3rd ring. Not a secretary. Her. I said, "My name is Hazel Voss. I have 9 acres in Carter County, Tennessee, and a mineral deposit someone's been trying to take for 60 years. I have documentary evidence of intimidation going back to 1961 and a sitting county sheriff with financial ties to the company that's been making offers on my land." A pause. She said, "Tell me more." So I did. 40 minutes. I told her about the notebook, the vials, the map, Cecil Drummond, the assay report, Harlan Pickett's letter to Cecil in October of 1961, my grandmother finding the letter in the impound truck in January of 1962 and keeping it for 59 years at the bottom of a mineral sample vial under a loose floorboard in a loft. I told her about Conrad Reith, the 3 meridian extraction applications in the county records, the offer at the end of the month. I told her about Pickett standing in the clearing 2 mornings ago. Stubborn women don't always get to finish what they start. Renata Foss listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you have physical custody of the Harlan Pickett letter?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Authenticated." I said, "Compared to his signature on county records from the same period, consistent." Another pause. She said, "How quickly can you make copies of everything?" I said, "I can drive to Elizabethton tomorrow." She said, "Do it. Copies to me overnight. Originals stay where they are." Then, "Ms. Voss, don't sell." I said, "I know." She said, "And don't let anyone in that cabin who you didn't invite." I said, "Too late for the first part, working on the second." She said the Pickett letter was, and she paused before the word significant. I said, "How significant?" She said, "The kind of significant that tends to make companies reconsider their positions." After I hung up, I sat in the dark cabin for a while with the fire going low and thought about my grandmother making a phone call like that. alone in this cabin in 1962, 32 years old, calling someone who could help. Except she couldn't, because there was no Renata Foss in 1962, no Blue Ridge Land Defense, no recorded line between a county official and an extraction company to point at. Just a woman alone on a mountain with a letter she'd taken from a dead man's truck and no way to use it. So she had done the only thing she could. She kept it, and she waited. I went up and put another split of oak in the stove and banked it for the night. The copy shop on Main Street in Elizabethton had a self-service machine and nobody behind the counter who would ask questions. I made 3 copies of everything. The assay report, the Harlan Pickett letter, the pages from the notebook with the property line notes and the sketch, my grandmother's notes from the vials, Cece's testimony written out by hand, which she'd handed me that morning at her kitchen table, 4 pages clear-eyed and precise, the handwriting of a woman who had been preparing to write this document for a long time. 1 copy to Renata Foss, overnight mail. 1 copy to a fireproof lockbox I left with Donna at the pharmacy in Elizabethton, who had helped me find the Meridian applications in the county records, and who said, when I called to explain what I needed without surprise and without hesitation, "You bring it here, and I will keep it, and nobody will ask me anything, because nobody ever asks me anything. And I have been here for 31 years. 3rd copy back to the cabin with me. Originals back under the loose board. I drove home up the gravel road in the late afternoon and walked the last half mile in the cold, with something settled in my chest that had not been settled in a long time. 4 days later, Renata Foss sent me a 3-page email. The Harlan Pickett letter cross-referenced with Meridian's filing history and Cecil Drummond's death record created a credible pattern of coordinated interference with property rights. Not provable beyond criminal standard, but provable enough for civil action. Provable enough to file a complaint with the State Attorney General's office. Provable enough to be a serious problem for anyone associated with Meridian if it became public. The Pickett family connection. Dale Pickett's documented financial interest in Meridian through a shell company called Ridgeview Holdings, LLE, registered in Knoxville in 2003, was separately actionable under Tennessee's conflict of interest statutes for elected officials. Renata had found Ridgeview Holdings on her own. I had not known about it yet, which meant she had been digging before she even had all the documents. She ended the email with, "I'd like to file preliminary notices to both Meridian Extraction and the Carter County Sheriff's Office this week, pending your authorization. This will not be subtle. They will know what it means. Do you want to proceed?" I typed back 1 word. Yes. The morning I decided to confront Dale Pickett directly, I didn't tell anyone. Not Cece. Not Renata. Because Cece would have wanted to come with me, and I needed to do this alone. And Renata would have advised against it correctly, professionally, from a purely legal standpoint. But there are things that are not about legal standpoints. There are things that are about standing up. I drove to the county courthouse in Elizabethton on a Tuesday morning in March. Parked on Main Street,
walked in through the front door.
The county offices were on the second floor. The sheriff's office had a reception desk and a deputy behind it who looked about 22 and had the expression of someone who had not yet learned to conceal boredom. I said I needed to speak with Sheriff Pickett. He said, "Do you have an appointment?" I said no. He looked at me. I looked back. He picked up the phone. Pickett came out 2 minutes later. He was in his full uniform, which I suspected he wore as armor the way some people wear expensive suits. He looked at me with a face that gave nothing away and said, "Ms. Voss, what can I do for you?" I said, "I'd like to talk. Somewhere the deputy doesn't need to hear." A beat. Then he said, "Come on back." His office had a window overlooking the parking lot and a desk with a clear surface that suggested either very little work or very careful management of appearances. A photograph of a woman and 2 children on the credenza. A framed certificate from the Tennessee Sheriff's Association. He sat behind the desk. I sat across from it. I said, "I know about Ridgeview Holdings." Nothing moved in his face. I said, "I know your father wrote a letter to Cecil Drummond in October of 1961, warning him about the risks of not selling. I know Cecil Drummond was dead 11 weeks later. I know the sheriff at the time ruled it an accident." I paused. "I know your father was that sheriff." Still nothing. I said, "I know Conrad Reith visited my grandmother in September of 2019. I know she said no. I know she was dead 6 weeks later." Something moved then, barely, a tightening around the eyes, gone as fast as it came. I said, "My grandmother waited 59 years for someone who wouldn't flinch. She kept every piece of evidence, every document, the original letter from your father to Cecil Drummond, all of it, and she left it to me with specific instructions." I set a folder on the desk, copies of the key documents. Blue Ridge Land Defense filed preliminary notices to Meridian Extraction and this office yesterday morning. I imagine your attorney has already called you. He looked at the folder. "Did not touch it." I said, "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to tell you directly, person to person, that I know what this is. And I know what my grandmother knew. And I know what she endured to keep that land and keep that evidence for 60 years alone on a mountain while your family benefited from what your father did." I stopped, breathed. "I thought you should hear that from me, not from an attorney." The room was very quiet. Outside, through the window, a car crossed the parking lot. A cloud moved across the March sun, and the light in the room shifted and settled. Pickett sat with his hands flat on the desk. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then he said, "I'm not my father." I said, "I know that." He said, "What happened in 61? He didn't finish the sentence. I said, "I know that too." He looked at the folder. He said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want you to stay away from my property. I want Meridian to withdraw their interest formally and permanently. and I want the 4-acre survey correction filed with the county records office by the end of the month." He was quiet. I stood up, said, "The documents are copies. The originals are in 3 separate locations. If anything happens to me or to C.C. Drummond, they go to the state attorney general automatically." I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. My grandmother didn't have that option. I do. I walked out of his office, down the hall, down the stairs, out through the front door of the Carter County Courthouse, onto Main Street, in the cold March air. My hands were shaking now. Both of them. The shaking that comes after, not during, when the body finally gets the message that something large just happened. I stood on the sidewalk and breathed. Then I walked to my car. Conrad Reith called that Thursday morning. The landline rang at 7:45. I was on my second coffee, sitting at the table with the notebook open, reading through the 1947 sections again. I picked up. He said, "Ms. Voss." I said, "Mr. Reith." A pause. He said, "I've received correspondence from Blue Ridge Land Defense." I said, "I know." Another pause, longer. He said, "My client would like to withdraw the purchase offer." I said, "All right." He said, "Formally and permanently." I said, "I'll let my attorney know." He said, "Ms. Voss, for what it's worth." He stopped, started again. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman." I said, "I know." He hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment. Then I put it down and looked out the east window at the morning light coming through the glass the way it always did. Low and gray and uncertain at first. Then steadier. Then warm. Now the real question. The 4-acre survey correction was filed at the Carter County Records Office on March 28, 2020. I was there when it was processed. Donna was behind the counter. She looked at the document, looked at me, looked at the document again. She said, "This has been wrong since 1947. I said, "My grandmother knew since 1962. Donna shook her head slowly in the way of a woman who has seen a great deal of paperwork over 31 years and has developed opinions about all of it. She stamped it, filed it. 13 acres now. 13 acres of steep Appalachian timber with a high-grade rhodonite deposit sitting in the southeast corner that a company had been circling for 60 years. I could sell, not to Meridian, never to Meridian, but to someone else, someone clean. There were conservation organizations that paid fair market value for mineral rights. There were small-scale operators who worked ethically and paid landowners properly. I could extract, hire it done right, permitted, reclaimed, managed. I could do a dozen things with what I had. I sat with that for most of March. I split wood and repaired the foundation corner and got the chainsaw running with a new pull cord I'd ordered from a hardware supplier in Elizabethton. Every evening, I sat at the table with the notebook and read and thought. Not about the money, about what the money represented, about what my grandmother had chosen. She had known since 1961 what was in that ground. She had understood its value. She had been the most practical person I had ever known. A woman who kept Portland cement on a list she gave an attorney and underlined it twice, who wrote a manual for her cabin before she wrote anything personal, who had kept a letter that could have destroyed a county sheriff's family for 60 years, and used it for exactly nothing except protection. She hadn't kept the land because she didn't understand what was in it. She had kept it because she understood exactly what was in it, and she understood something else. That some things once extracted cannot be put back. A mineral deposit is a finite thing. You take it out, it's gone. The ground where it was is changed. The water table around it is changed. The hillside is changed. The 60-foot seam that had been sitting untouched since before her grandfather was born would be gone in a season if a commercial operation got into it. And the mountain that had given her everything she needed, not everything she wanted. The mountain would remember. I thought about my grandmother at 32, almost my age, sitting in this cabin after they buried Cecil Drummond, with the letter in her pocket that she'd taken from the impound truck, with a company's name and a county official's signature and no way to use either. She could have sold then. She'd had every reason to. Alone, winter coming, a secret that was dangerous to keep. She stayed, and I thought about why she stayed, and I thought about it for most of March, and somewhere in the middle of a cold Tuesday afternoon, working on the east wall insulation with my hands caked in cold clay and my back aching and my hair full of dried moss from the gap between the logs. Somewhere in there, I understood. She stayed because the cabin was the only thing she had that was entirely hers, not given by a husband, not earned in someone else's office, not dependent on anyone else's approval or mercy or continued goodwill. Just hers, built with her father's labor and maintained with her own, standing on a mountain in Carter County, Tennessee, because she had stood there herself and refused to leave. And the mineral deposit wasn't a windfall, it was a test. The same test it had always been. Every time the company came back, every time a man in a good coat drove up the gravel road with a number in his pocket, the same question asked over and over. What are you willing to keep? I put down the insulation material and sat on the porch step in the cold afternoon air. The clearing was quiet. The tree line held its shape against the late March sky. The creek ran 60 yards south, and I could hear it high from the snow melt off the north ridge louder than it had been all winter. I knew what I was going to do, had probably known for a while. I called Renata Foss that evening, said, I want to donate the mineral rights to a conservation land trust. Permanent restriction, no extraction, no commercial development. The surface rights stay with me. She said, I know which one to call. I said, the Appalachian Land Preservation Trust. She said, how did you know about them? I said, my grandmother mentioned them in the notebook. She looked them up in 1987 wrote that the time wasn't right yet. A pause. Renata said, "Hazel." I said, "I know." She said, "This means the mineral value stays in the ground permanently." I said, "I know what it means." She said, "You're certain?" I said, "I'm certain." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll draw up the papers." I said, "Thank you." She said, "No, thank your grandmother." The paperwork took 6 weeks. The Appalachian Land Preservation Trust sent 2 people to walk the property with me in late April. A woman named Sylvia who wore good boots and spoke about rhodonite formations the way people speak about things they love, and a man named Garrett who took soil samples and kept apologizing for the mud. I walked them to the exposed seam on the southeast slope. The 60 feet of rock face where the 1961 slide had taken the hillside and left the geology visible. Sylvia stood there for a long time, just looking. The way you look at something when you understand what it took to preserve it. She said, 60 years. This has been sitting here untouched for 60 years. I said, my grandmother made sure of it. She said, we'll make sure of it from here. The deed restriction was recorded on May 14th, 2020. Dale Pickett did not run for re-election in the fall of 2020. The official reason was family health concerns. The unofficial reason was the kind of thing that moves quietly through a small county and doesn't need to be said out loud to be understood. Ridgeview Holdings LLC was dissolved in September of 2020. Meridian Extraction made no further applications in Carter County. Conrad Reith retired from private practice at the end of the year. I didn't keep track of these things deliberately. I found out the way you find things out in a small county. From Donna at the records office. From Cece, who knew everything that happened within 20 miles from some invisible network that I suspected had been operating since before I was born. What I kept track of was the cabin. April came, and the snow finished melting off the north ridge, and the creek dropped back to its summer level, and the hemlock stand went from gray to green in the space of about 2 weeks, like someone had made a decision overnight. I planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the cabin, in the strip of ground that got afternoon sun, following notes in the notebook about soil depth and drainage that my great-grandfather had written in 1947 and that my grandmother had added to in 1973 and again in 1989. 3 generations of notes about what grew well in that particular strip of ground. I added my own in the margins. The floor was fully repaired by mid-April. New boards cut from timber I'd felled on the southeast slope, dried over the winter in the shed, fitted into the gaps in the subfloor, with a fit that was not perfect, but was mine. I'd done it myself. Every board, every nail. My hands looked different than they had in January. Not bad different, strong different. The kind of hands that had learned something. Cece came up every week or so, not on a schedule, just when she came. She would arrive with something from her garden or her kitchen, and we would sit at the table and drink coffee and talk about the property or the season or what needed doing next. She didn't talk much about her father, but one afternoon in May, She stood at the east window for a while, looking out at the clearing, and she said, "He would have liked you." I said, "I know I would have liked him." She said, "He was careful the way you're careful. He paid attention to things." I said, "I think that's what got him in trouble." She said, "I think so too." She turned from the window. "But I also think he would have said it was worth it, to have paid attention, to have known what was there, even if he couldn't hold on to it." I thought about that for a long time after she left, paying attention, knowing what was there. In late May, I found the last page. I had read the notebook cover to cover 3 times by then. Thought I knew every page. But notebooks are like cabins. You keep finding things you missed. The last page of the composition book, the inside back cover, had been glued shut. The kind of thing you don't notice unless you're looking for it. I found it when I was going over the notebook for the 4th time and noticed the back cover was slightly thicker than it should have been. I worked the edge open with my folding knife. Careful, slow. Inside were 2 pages folded together, hand cut to fit. The top sheet was in my grandmother's handwriting. Late writing, slow and careful the way her letters had gotten in the last years of her life. She had written it in the summer of 2019. 3 months before Conrad Reith came up the gravel road. 4 months before she died. I want to write this plainly. I have lived here for 48 years. I have been cold, and I have been warm, and I have been frightened, and I have not been frightened, and I have been lonelier than I knew a person could be, and I have also been more content than I knew a person could be. Both things, not one or the other. I never regretted staying, not once, not in the worst winters, not when the roof leaked and the floor rotted and I couldn't afford to fix either. Not when the company came back every decade like a bad season offering numbers that would have changed my life, wearing down my certainty. I never regretted it, but I want whoever finds this to understand something. I didn't stay because I was strong. I stayed because I understood what I would lose if I left. That's a different thing. Strength is when you don't feel the fear. I felt all of it, every winter, every time the company sent someone up that road, every time I sat alone in this room and looked at what I had and what I didn't have, and ran the math and came up on the wrong side again. I felt all of it, and I stayed anyway, not because I was brave, because I understood what this place was, what it had given me, what it was asking me to give back. The mountain doesn't reward hurry, but it rewards faithfulness. I hope you understand that when you read it. I hope you've had enough time here to understand it in your body, not just your mind. The body knows things the mind hasn't processed yet. This mountain taught me that. Take care of it, the way it took care of me. I sat at the table with those pages for a long time. The fire was going. The late afternoon light came through the east windows. The creek ran somewhere below in the hollow, the particular sound it made in May when the water was full but not flooding. A sound like something going where it was supposed to go.
My grandmother had been 32 years old when she sat in this cabin alone with a dead man's letter in her pocket and a company's name in her mind and a winter coming.
I was 34, 2 years older. 2 years that felt like they contained several lifetimes each. I thought about Nashville, the apartment, the office, my ex-husband's car in the driveway of the house that used to be half mine. The exhaustion that comes not from hard work, but from spending years trying to be a version of yourself that was never quite true. I had driven up this gravel road in January with $200 and a sleeping bag and nowhere else to go. That was still true, but it meant something different now. Now it meant I had come to exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Not despite having nothing, because of it. Because I arrived without the weight of what I thought I was supposed to want. Empty enough to be filled by something real. I turned to the last page, my grandmother's final entry, dated November 3rd, 2019, 2 weeks before she died. Winter coming early this year, the first hard frost already. I split the last of the firewood this morning and it was good work. The kind of work that makes sense. I want to write that down. It makes sense. I will not make it to spring. I know this the way I have always known things about this mountain. Not with my mind first, with my body. The way the cold sits differently this year. The way I am tired. In a way I haven't been tired before. I am not afraid. I have done what I set out to do. I kept the land. I kept the evidence. I found the right person to leave it to. She doesn't know yet that she's the right person. She'll find out when she gets here. The mountain will tell her. It told me everything I needed to know. Trust the mountain. Trust yourself. Come home. I closed the notebook, set it on the table. Outside, the late light was going warm and low through the east windows. The clearing held it for a moment, that particular gold that comes at the end of a May afternoon in the Tennessee mountains. Everything sharp and clear. Every leaf on the tree line catching it and throwing it back. I got up and went to the door, opened it. The air was warm for the first time in months. Really warm. The kind of warm that means the season has turned for real. The hemlock stand was full and green down the slope. The creek was audible from where I stood. The kitchen garden on the south side was showing the first thin lines of green along the rows. I stood in the doorway and looked at all of it. The 13 acres, my grandmother's 48 years, and her father's years before her, and whatever years would come after mine. The mineral deposit sitting undisturbed in the southeast slope. Permanent, belonging now to no one's profit and everyone's future. The 4 acres that hadn't existed on paper since 1947. and that existed now exactly where they had always physically been, exactly where my grandmother had known them to be. Her careful lines in the margin of a field guide, the fro in the shed with the handmade ash handle, the wood stacked low against the stone away from the moisture, because whoever stacked it knew what they were doing. Cece's father walking a property line after a slide and finding something beautiful in the exposed rock. My grandmother taking a letter from an impound truck in January 1962 and keeping it for 59 years. All of it. Every careful, patient, deliberate act of a woman who understood what she had and what it was worth in ways that no number could capture. I thought about what she'd written. I didn't stay because I was strong. I stayed because I understood what I would lose if I left. I turned back into the cabin, picked up the notebook from the table, flipped to the last page where my grandmother's November 3rd entry ended with 2 words: "Come home." Below it, the page was blank. My page. I found the pencil stub on the shelf, sat down at the table, wrote the date, May 21st, 2020. Then I wrote what came next. Not a summary, not an accounting of what had happened, or what I'd done, or what I'd decided. Just what was true right now, in this moment, in this room. Roof holds, garden is in, spring came early this year. And then the last line, the same line my grandmother had written in 1972, the first spring she spent alone on this mountain after her husband left, and before she understood yet that she would never leave. I'm still here. I closed the notebook, set it back on the shelf between the field guide and the tin of matches. Spine out, the way I kept it. Outside, the last of the day's light was moving off the clearing and into the tree line, and the mountain was settling into the quiet of a May evening in Carter County, Tennessee. Unhurried, full. The kind of quiet that isn't empty. The kind that means something is still here.